I have too many pieces of paper. There we go. Let me introduce this final lecture by telling you what I'm going to tell you. I've tried to give you some examples of basic law and economics with regard to property law and tort law and criminal law. As you all know, there are many other subjects that we could discuss. And in the interest of time, I was told that those were probably the three most important things for me to cover. We've also covered a few other things very lightly. For example, I talked about the relationship between law and social norms. That's an interesting topic that arose from the work of law and economics scholars in the United States. And I brought to your attention the work of Ganese and Rustaccini, who showed us that we may miss the point that people sometimes take a fine as just another price for engaging in particular activity. You'll remember that was the example of the daycare centers, being late to pick up your children at a daycare center in Israel. Today, I'm going to try to talk about two newer areas in law and economics, just to give you a flavor of what we're doing. And I'll conclude with a cartoon that will illustrate what I've tried to achieve this week. And I'm also going to ask Hitesh to put up a short video from the internet that I think illustrates some of the points that I'll be making about the behavioral law and economics. Behavioral law and economics is a new version of law and economics, and it brings the insights of behavioral psychology into the discussion of the relationship between economics and law. The origins of behavioral law and economics are the work of Danny Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize in economics. He's a psychologist, but he won the Nobel Prize in economics in 2002. And his late colleague and collaborator, Amos Tversky, Tversky, also a psychologist. In the late 1970s and throughout the 1980s and 1990s, Kahneman and Tversky were the leading people who were doing experiments, a form of empirical work, to try to see if people obeyed the predictions of rational choice theory. And as we will see with a couple of examples, what they found was that in their experiments, people do not obey the predictions of the rational choice theory. And behavioral law and economics people took up those findings of Kahneman and Tversky and applied them to some of the standard analyses of property law, tort law, contract law, environmental law, and the like. I'll try to give you a flavor of all of that today. I'll try to describe behavioral economics, show how it might affect our analysis of the law, and give you some examples from tort law, criminal law, and procedure. And finally, I want to consider some criticisms that have been made of behavioral law and economics. I think that's absolutely essential for you to know. So to the third slide, please, Hitesh. I have assumed throughout the week, and I told you that it was just an assumption, I have assumed that that the decision makers whose work we're examining, whose choices we're examining.
Kushagra, third slide, please. Sorry, sir, to intervene.
That's okay. No, thank you. Third slide, please. I've made the assumption that people are rational. They make decisions that are very well suited to maximizing their happiness or utility. Economists take that assumption so much for granted that we usually don't even need to make that assumption. We don't need to articulate it out loud. We don't need to talk about it as something that is really important to our analysis. But to non-economists, the people with whom I interacted for 35 years in the academy, that assumption that people are rationally self-interested is a very strong assumption, and one that they do not swallow easily. As I told you before, I've had people at seminars at law schools say to me, "Who are these rational people you're talking about? I don't know anybody like that." I don't think we need to go to the other extreme and assume that people are irrational. That's unnecessary. But I do think that we ought to admit that there are imperfections in the human ability to make decisions. We make assumptions about imperfections in the marketplace. And why not make those same assumptions about how human beings think? And as I hope to show you, if we do make assumptions that people are imperfectly rational, we're going to reach some different conclusions in some cases about how people are likely to respond to the law. Let me make one final introductory remark about this matter. I think that one of the things that we need to think about as we go forward in the field of law and economics is that rationality may be imperfect in individuals, but we might want to think more carefully about whether group decision making is imperfect. People engaged in competition in the marketplace, business associations, corporations, firms, they make collective decisions through a board of directors or a management team. And is it fair to assume that the decisions made by a group of people have the same imperfections or different imperfections as the imperfections in our individual thought processes? That's one point I want to draw your attention to. There has been some literature on the imperfections of group decision making, and I'd be happy to give you the citations to that literature if you would be kind enough to send me an email. But I don't think there's been enough. I think we need to have more studies of the imperfections of group decision making. Another subject that arises because of behavioral law and economics is, what do we do about imperfections? Can we correct them in the same way that we can correct market imperfections through public policies, in the law, in taxation policy, in regulation, and the like? Attempts to correct for those individual imperfections in decision making are referred to as de-biasing, D-E-B-I-A-S, de-biasing, trying to teach people or create situations that cause them to think more clearly than they otherwise would. And I'll give you an example of that as well. Next slide, please. I'm going to give you two slides here. I'm sorry, one more. Oh, I'm sorry, this is the right one. Thank you. I've mentioned Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, and we'll discuss some of their experiments this morning. Let me give you some brief examples of the use of behavioral economics to look at topics in law and economics. There is an imperfection in human thinking that has been established by cognitive and social psychologists called status quo bias, or the endowment effect. The status quo bias says that we have a particular attachment to the way things are, and we do not easily change away from the status quo, the way things are. That's sometimes referred to as the endowment effect. We've been given something, and we're much more reluctant to give it up than we would be to acquire it. The recognition of the status quo bias or endowment effect has something to do, it's got some implications for our analysis of the Coase theorem. The Coase theorem, remember, says that when transaction costs are zero, there will be an efficient result, regardless of the law. That theorem implicitly depends on the rationality of people and recognizing the different costs that can obtain from where a legal right or a legal duty is assigned. The status quo bias tells us, do not presume that people are going to be very quick to give up a legal right that they have. In the assumption, in the examples I gave you of farmers and ranchers, and the cattle can interfere with the farmers' crops, we assumed that the farmers and the ranchers understood exactly what the prices of the different alternatives available to them are. But the status quo bias says that wherever we assign the right, whether we assign the right to the rancher to have no duty to supervise his or her cattle, or we assign the right to the farmer to be free from invasion by anybody's cattle, that can matter. And it may mean that people who have the right are going to be far more reluctant to give it up than we have assumed in our analysis of the Coase theorem. Another example of a behavioral law and economics finding is something called the confirmation bias. The confirmation bias says that when we evaluate different theories, different states of the world, different courses of action, we tend to look for information that confirms our original beliefs. That is, we do not look for evidence that would threaten our beliefs. There are some wonderful examples of this in the literature that I won't go into, but I think all of us recognize that. With this important caveat, I think as academics, we live in a world in which minds are changed by the argumentation that our colleagues and students make to us. Outside of the academy, I'm not so sure that that happens as often as it does within the academy, within the profession of being a professional scholar. Outside of the academy, I suspect that the confirmation bias is very much stronger than it is within the academy, because we've all had our minds changed about things. That's part of what we do when we talk with each other. Another example of a behavioral imperfection is the over-optimism bias. There's extensive literature that suggests that we are all over-optimistic about our own life circumstances. We all think we're going to do better in life than we do. We're going to have more income than we thought we have. We're going to be more successful than we thought we would be. And so on and so forth. Over-optimism can cause problems. We all think, this is a particularly American example, but we all think we're better drivers of automobiles than we are. And as a result, we may not pay as much attention to the laws and rules of the road, and there may be more accidents because of this over-optimism. a famous example of this that you can try yourself is at the start of a class that you're teaching, ask the students to give you an estimate of the grade they're going to get and at the end of the class, and then compare that estimate with what happens at the end of the class. At the beginning of the class, almost everybody's going to get top grades. And at the end of the class, that can't be true. Finally, another example, a final example, is what's called the availability heuristic. That says that in making decisions about things that they're uncertain about, people tend to use whatever information is readily available to them. They don't necessarily search on the internet and multiple places on the internet to find out what really is the case. Here's a very famous example that I won't ask you because I can't interact with you, but you'll see the example. I always ask my classes at this when we start this section, what is more common in the United States, murder or suicide? That is, murder or self-murder, murder of another person or self-murder. And almost everyone in the class says murder is more common than suicide. And I ask them why they think that's the case. And they say, well, the news on television, the news on radio, the news in the print media of the newspaper always discusses murders. And as a result, we presume there are a lot more murders. It doesn't discuss suicides. Well, that's true. The journalists do not typically discuss suicide unless it's of a very prominent person like the comedian Robin Williams. However, in the United States, there are 3 times more suicides every year than there are murders. There are about 15,000 homicides or murders every year, and about 45,000 to 50,000 suicides. Suicide is far more common. And if you're looking for yet another reason to think about gun control, think about the fact that 90% of suicides are done with a gun. And if it was more difficult to get a gun, it would be more difficult to commit suicide. Okay, next slide. This is a cartoon. And I love to give students this cartoon. It will be difficult for you to see the details of this cartoon. So let me tell you what it shows. On the left, it shows an older white man carrying groceries. Obviously, he's been shopping at the grocery store and is going home. On the right-hand side is a young black man who is carrying an envelope that he is presumably taking to the post office to send someplace. Above each person's head is a list of factors that they are presumed to be thinking about in deciding whether to talk to the other person. And what's funny about this cartoon is nobody thinks like this, but this is how a rational theory person would think that young black men and older white men make a decision about whether to talk to the other person. For example, the older white man has divided up his thought process into risk factors and mitigating factors. And among the risk factors that he checks off are this other person is black and he's male and he has his baseball cap on backwards. The implication is that those all constitute risk factors, which is funny in itself. But there are mitigating factors. He's wearing loafers, that is, not tie-up shoes. He's wearing shoes that are common among white people. And he's whistling a song from a very famous composer named Stephen Sondheim. And he's carrying a FedEx envelope, and he's wearing a polo shirt. Now, this might not resonate with you, but it's amusing to think that anybody would make a calculation on the basis of these facts. But the risk factors are less, 3, than the mitigating factors, 4. And as a result, it's an acceptable risk to say good evening. The young black man is going through a similar calculation about risk factors and mitigating factors, and he too finds that the mitigating factors are greater than the risk factors, and so he assumes it's an acceptable risk to say good evening. What's amusing about this is that's a cartoonish but nonetheless instructive cartoon about how rational choice theory thinks people make decisions. And in both cases, the rational thing to do is to say good evening. Okay, next slide, please. Now, this is a slide you don't often see in a law and economics class or in an economics class or a law class. This is a urinal in one of the men's rooms at Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam. And if you look very closely, you will see that just to the northwest of the bottom of the urinal, there's a fly in the urinal. Can you all see that? Let me tell you what this is all about, because it's a story about behavioral law and economics. I have to be careful how I talk about this, so forgive me. The janitors at Schiphol Airport have to clean the men's rooms and the women's rooms, the restrooms, several times every day. And one of the things that the janitors brought to the attention of their supervisors was that they were spending a lot more time cleaning the men's restrooms than they were cleaning the women's restrooms. And their explanation for this difference was that men were not as careful about where they did their urinating as women were. And that most of the extra time was devoted to cleaning the floor after men had gone to the bathroom. And the janitors had a suggestion about how to minimize the cleanup time in men's restrooms. What they suggested was putting a decal, a painted picture of a fly in the men's urinal, because men like to shoot at things. And if we put this decal in the urinal, men will be careful to try to urinate in the urinal rather than around the urinal. And that the presence of this fly is going to direct their attention. It worked. The janitorial costs in Schiphol Airport fell by approximately a third, just because of this taking advantage of men's desire to shoot at things, even when they were urinating. And it's a wonderful story about how using a clever idea. You know, what most economists would have suggested is we'll put a sign up, and we'll start with signs that says, please be careful when you're urinating. Or if that doesn't work, we'll put up a sign that there will be a fine for inaccurate urinating, or something of the sort. But the reason this is such a good example is it uses a factor about the male mind to try to achieve a desirable end. In the United States today, you can buy these decals at a hardware store to put in your home toilets, in case you have young men in the household, as my wife and I did. Okay, the next slide. Before we begin this next slide, these two applications, I would like Hitesh to look at the Microsoft Word document page that I sent him that has a link to the internet. Can you see that, or can I try to do it from my my computer? Shall I try to do it from my computer? Let me see if I can. Oh, I can't. Hang on, I'll have to check something. Okay, here we go. This is, can you see this? No, you can't see this yet. I'm going to play a very short video. It's about 2 minutes long, and let me tell you what it's about. It's about a professional pickpocket, somebody who goes into a crowd and steals things from people's pockets. This is a professional pickpocket who makes videos show people how a professional pickpocket can steal things from them. So let me try to share this video with you. So here we go.
Hey, Craig. Hey, guys. This is just my workout stuff. If you have a secret identity, you need to keep it secret. And if you want to save by bundling home and car insurance, you need Geico.
You're still wearing your mask, dude.
Okay, here we go.
Back to school. Before you submit your essays, run it through Grammarly to quickly check
Too many ads.
punctuation or
I'm going to show you something that's not completely legal. Amazing. But did you happen to notice all the things that have changed since the scene began? Action. I'm going to show you something that's not completely legal. Go! While we held your attention on the money, the table turned to a stool. Go! Apollo magically got a new hat and handkerchief. And all the posters and cards in the background changed. Your brain just played a trick on you. We all think we're paying close attention to the world around us. But strange as it may sound, this is just an illusion. Nope. Misdirection is an elegant form of attention control. Our brains only allow us to really focus on one thing at a time. So when we have you deciphering a mystery down here, another mystery can be happening back here. So, did you miss the 8 things that changed throughout the scene? Don't feel bad if you were fooled.
Oh, okay. I'm going to try to. Oh, shoot. What have I done?
Still not convinced you've got a one-track mind? Apollo's got a trick for you. Try to catch how he does it.
I'm trying to
what he has to say.
stop this.
I get asked all the time, where is the safest place
There we
to keep
are.
your stuff?
Okay,
really
back to the slide.
A little bit more involved. You have to get inside the mind of the people.
I'm sorry, I meant to. Golly, what have I done? There we go. That video was by a very famous magician named Apollo Robbins. He has many videos on the internet, and he has a TED Talk, TED, Technology, Education, and Design Talk, about attention and how what a magician tries to do is take advantage of the fact that it's difficult for us to focus. But when we do focus, we miss a lot of things that are going on in the background. I love that video because I like magic, as I've mentioned before, but it's also the case that it illustrates the proposition that we now know to be the case, is that behavioral insights are very valuable for magicians and pickpockets and other thieves. I've already mentioned one of these applications of behavioralism to the legal topics, let me mention two others. The importance of default rules. Default rules are rules that begin a situation or begin an interaction. With regard to organ transplantation, there are two important different default rules that we can start with. One default rule says, we, society, can take your organs when you die unless you tell us not to take your organs. The other default rule says, we will not take your organs unless you give us explicit permission to take your organs after you die. Now, those sound very close to each other, but they're different starting points. In one, the state can take your organs, but they can't if you say, don't take my organs. The other is, we can't take your organs, and the state has to ask us for permission to take our organs. The Coase theorem might suggest that where we start, which default rule we choose, doesn't matter to things. But this is an important factor because there's a great excess demand for organ transplantations. To give you an example, there are in the United States approximately 70,000 kidney transplants every year, but there's a demand for almost 150,000 kidney transplants. The 80,000 who do not receive a kidney transplant don't receive it because the supply is not as big as it should. How can we increase the supply of organs for transplantation? Well, one of the ways it turns out is to change the default rule from opt-in, that is, the starting point is you can't take the organs, presumed denial, to opt-out, presumed consent. How do we know that would make a difference? Fortunately for social scientists, in the European Union, approximately, there are 25 countries in the European Union, approximately half of them have an opt-in rule, starting from the proposition you can't take the organs, but with permission you can. And the other half use an opt-out rule. That is, we can take your organs unless you told us you can't. If the Coase theorem is correct, there shouldn't be much difference between the countries in Europe that have an opt-in rule and the countries in Europe that have an opt-out rule. But one of the things that we've discovered or found because of careful empirical work is that in the countries that have an opt-out rule, a presumed consent to take a person's organs, the lowest donation rate in the opt-out countries is 80% of the people who die. Only 20% bother to opt out of the system. In the opt-in system, even though people tell us that they would like to donate their organs, after they die, they haven't done anything to suggest, to say, yes, you can take my organs. So in the opt-in jurisdictions, the donation rates are 10, 20, 30% at the most. Having an opt-out rule for organ transplantation at death is much, much, much better for the purposes of having an increased supply of organs for transplantation than the opt-in rule. And that's not what we would predict to have happened under the Coase theorem. The costs, the transaction costs of opting in or opting out are approximately the same. And yet people don't incur them. They may suffer from the status quo bias. So if you begin with an opt-in rule, they think, well, I guess that's the law and I guess I'll obey it and not do anything about it. Or if they live in a jurisdiction that has an opt-out rule, they start with that and stay with it. There are ways to make use of this default rule option in retirement savings accounts. I'll leave you to read about those others. Another example I want to draw to your attention are the forms of regulation. The forms of regulation in economics have been changed by the findings of behavioral economics. For example, suppose that we'd like to reduce energy use in the homes and apartments and condominiums of and businesses of people. How do we do that? Well, an economist, traditional economists would say, raise the price or change the prices between the daylight hours and the nighttime hours. Try to make it cheaper to use energy at nighttime than to use it during the day. But modern behavioral law and economics suggests there's a better way to do it. And that is to inform consumers about how their energy use compares to that of their neighbors. There's no need to identify the neighbors, but in our bills that we receive every month, it's very easy for the energy company to say, you're using this much electricity, and that's approximately twice as much as your neighbors are using on average. And it turns out that in the jurisdictions where the utility companies have done this sort of thing for electricity use, water use, and other natural gas use, that telling people how their behavior compares to that of their neighbors is a very powerful motivator for people to reduce their use of natural gas, electricity generally, and water. Next slide, please. This is another finding of the behavioral literature that's very important to the law, I think. And that's the recognition that we have a dual system of thinking. That dual system of thinking are called System 1 and System 2. They do not correspond to particular organs in our brain, but there have been lots of experiments that suggest that we use these two systems to think about things. System 1 is the description of the thinking process that gives a quick answer. It's the default method of thinking about things. And it was obviously developed when the human species was very young, was living in a hostile world, and we had to make quick decisions. For example, is that thing running at me a dangerous animal, or is it a friend? System 1 thinking is quick, intuitive, and the default mechanism. System 2 is the system that we have developed over the course of being civilized and was particularly refined in the course of the Enlightenment in the 17th and 18th centuries around the world. It's a deliberative, slow, and logical method of thinking. I've included a copy of a very famous, in the materials that I sent to Madam Nagar and to Hitesh, I have sent a copy of what's called the cognitive reflection test. And I think you'd find it interesting to do this test. Here are two of the three questions. A bat and a ball together cost $1.10. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? Using System 1, most people say 10 cents. That's the wrong answer. If the ball costs 10 cents, then the bat costs $1 more. The bat must cost $1.10, and together they would cost $1.20. The ball costs 5 cents, not 10 cents. But you only get that answer if you invoke System 2 thinking. It's 5 cents for the ball because if the bat costs $1 more, the bat is $1.05. And together, the bat and the ball cost $1.05 plus 5 cents, or $1.10. So System 1 gives one answer, System 2 gives another answer, the correct answer. Another famous example. In a lake, there is a patch of lily pads. Every day, the patch doubles in size. if it takes 48 days for the patch to cover the entire lake, how long will it take for the patch to cover half of the lake? The System 1 answer is 24 days. The correct answer is 47 days. Remember, the lily pad doubles every day. So if it's entirely full on the 48th day, it must have been half full on the 47th day. This so-called cognitive reflection test illustrates the difference between System 1 and System 2 thinking. And there's another very important finding about this in the literature, and that is that we can guide people to do System 2 thinking in particular ways. One way is to make the test disfluent. That's not a real word in English. So let me tell you what it means. Disfluency describes a situation in which something isn't right. Something, for example, in a written instruction, there may be mistakes in the writing, and so the writing is said to be disfluent. Some psychologists did an experiment in which they divided several classes into two groups. One group was given a copy of the cognitive reflection test that was perfectly clean, was done nicely. I've got a copy here. You can see that this is just a clean piece of paper with the questions and an answer place. There are no misspellings, nothing's wrong with this. Half of each class got that test. The other half got a similar test, but there were mistakes in spelling. There were blotches of ink on some of the questions, so it was difficult to see what word was underneath the ink blot. Here's the question. Each group was given a minute to complete the test. Do you think that there was a difference between the group that received this clean copy of the test and the group that got the disfluent copy with mistakes in spelling and other strange things? Do you think the results of the test for these two groups were the same or different? And if they were different, who did better, the ones with the clean test or the ones with the disfluent tests? The answer is that the students with the disfluent tests did better than the students who had the clean copy, like the one I showed you. Why should that be the case? That's the case, psychologists believe, because the disfluency, the misspelled words, the ink blots, caused people to stop and look at the test and try to figure out, what's this person up to here? What's going on? Why is there this mistake? Why did they do this? And just the fact of stopping and thinking allowed people to switch to System 2. And they did better on the tests. I used to tell my law students, I'm going to give you a final exam, and some of you will have a clean final exam, and some of you will have a disfluent final exam with mistakes in the spelling and in the wording and some other things I'll put on there. And we'll see which group does better. They were law students, remember, so they were in a state of rebellion. You can't do that, professor. That's not fair. You can't experiment on us. I said to them, I'm only kidding. I'm not going to do that to you. But it makes the point, and they remembered it. Why is this important to know about in the law? I think it's tremendously important, and I've never seen anybody write an article about this, but they should. Somebody should, because the rules of legal procedure, I'm sure in almost every jurisdiction in the world, wants people making decisions about legal matters to use System 2, not System 1. And I'll bet if you went through and looked at some of the rules of, for example, criminal legal procedure, you'd see that some of those rules are designed to cause people to think in a System 2 fashion. I'll give you one example. In the United States, there are two phases in a criminal trial. One is the guilt or innocence phase, where the only question is, did this defendant commit the crime? The second phase is if he or she is guilty, it's called the sentencing phase. And if they are guilty, then the sentencing phase, there's another partial trial to decide how much punishment to inflict the thing on the defendant. In the rules of criminal procedure in the first phase, the guilt or innocence phase, do not allow the introduction of evidence about what crimes, if any, this person has committed in the past. Why? Now, an economist looking at this issue would say, you know, the probability that this person committed the current crime is affected by what we know about the number of crimes and the kinds of crimes the person has committed in the past. And we ought to be allowed to have that information. But courts do not allow that information to be introduced because they want people to focus only on the evidence about the particular crime that's being tried before the jury or before the judge. I think there are lots of other examples of the laws trying to get people to use system 2 thinking. And I cannot recommend highly enough this wonderful 2011 book by Danny Kahneman called Thinking, Fast and Slow. It's about the difference between system 1 and system 2 thinking. Okay, next slide. I'm sorry, I'm going much too slowly and I need to go faster. I'm going to talk only about a couple of examples of applying behavioral law and economics contract law. I haven't talked about contract law this week, but these examples are particularly useful. And the first thing I need to introduce you to is what's called framing. The framing effect is a very important thing. The framing effect says how the information that we give to people, how we present an issue to them, how we frame that issue can affect what they decide to do. So let me ask you to go to the next slide. Here's a very famous example of framing issues. And it's an imaginary conversation between the abbot in a group of monks, religious people who are isolated from the rest of the world. In the first of those, slide 10 if we could, in the first of those conversations, the first monk asks his leader, his abbot, whether it would be all right to smoke a cigarette, presumably, or a pipe. Would it be all right to smoke while he prayed? The abbot is scandalized and he says, of course not. That borders on sacrilege. That's an insult to God. Why would you do that? But a second monk goes to his leader and asks if it would be all right to pray while he smokes. Exactly the reverse question. And the abbot says, of course, God wants to hear from us at any time. Exactly the same question is being asked, but it's framed differently. And it gets a different response from the leader of the abbey, the abbot, depending on how you framed the request. That example comes from another book I recommend very highly called Mindware, Tools for Smart Thinking by the social psychologist Richard Nisbett, who teaches at the University of Michigan. Next slide, please, Hitesh. I want to give you some more background about framing. Kahneman and Tversky did the most famous examples to illustrate the difference about how you frame a problem. And they did these experiments with law and economics students, and they found the same results in any group to whom they gave this example. The first experiment asks the students to choose between some prevention strategies for dealing with a very serious disease, something like COVID-19, that might affect a patient population of 600 people. The first choice was between these two options. Option A is a public health strategy, and it is said to be the case that this strategy for dealing with the disease will save 200 lives. The second strategy, option B, has a 33% chance of saving all 600 subjects and a 67% chance of saving no one. I hope you can see that the expected value, I'm not going to explain this, but you'll see obviously what it is. The expected value of option A and of option B is the same. 200 lives are saved, right? How do we compute expected value? In option B, there are two possible outcomes, but we know the probability of those outcomes. 0.33 for saving all 600 subjects and 0.67 for saving none. So we calculate the expected value as being 0.33 times 600, which is 200, plus 0.67 times 0, which is 0. So the expected value of option B is 200. The expected value of option A is 200. Save 200 lives for certain. Which one of these two options did people choose? Well, if they're indifferent to risks, they'll be indifferent between options A and B. If they are risk averse, as the vast majority of individuals are, they'll choose option A. Why? It's the less risky one. And people are risk averse. They would rather have a certain outcome of equal value to an uncertain outcome. Okay, so Kahneman and Tversky gave this experiment to people, and something like 75% of those they gave it to chose option A, which is not a surprise, given what we know about attitudes about risk. Second example. Next slide, please. The second example, well, I talked about that, I'm sorry. So go on to the next slide. Number 4, there we go, that's the one. Then Kahneman and Tversky presented another choice about the same facts to different groups of people. And here are the options they asked people to choose between. Option C, this program, we're talking about an epidemic that could kill a lot of people among this population of 600. Option C, this program will result in the deaths of 400 people. Option D, this alternative program has a 33% chance of no one dying and a 67% chance that all 600 people will die. How do we compare the certainty of 400 deaths with the uncertain outcome under option D? Well, we perform the same experiment. The expected value of adopting strategy C is minus 200. I'm sorry, minus 400. In option D, we can compute the expected value as 0.33 times 0, which is 0, plus 0.67 times 600, which is minus 400. The expected value is exactly the same. We're going to lose 400 lives. But people preferred, in this case, option D to option C. What? How can that be? Now, I'm going to, in the interest of time, I'm going to leave you to sort this out. But here's why they did the experiment. These two choices between option C and option D, and the other choice between option A and option B, are exactly the same. They're exactly the same. Options, the choice between A and B focuses on the number of lives saved. The choice between C and D focuses on the number of lives lost. And what this experiment shows is how you frame this choice determines how people are going to choose. If you present it as a choice between losing 400 people for sure, or maybe saving some people in option D, people prefer to take the risk. They choose option D. So whether you present things as a choice about gains, that's options A and B, or losses, that's options C and D, determines how people behave. Now, I'm sorry, I'm using too much of your time, but let me ask you to turn to slide 16. In that, two economists at the University of Chicago decided to take this famous finding about framing to some factories in China. And I'll leave the details to you to read later. But the title is a wonderful title. The behavioralist visits the factory, increasing productivity using simple framing mechanisms. The two economists got the owners of the factory to agree to doing two different kinds of compensation. In one compensation, people received a base salary, but if they produced more than they were expected to produce, they got bonuses. And in the other frame, they got a base salary that was here, and money was taken away from them if they didn't meet the quota that they were supposed to produce. One is about gains, and the other is about losses. And which of those frames do you think workers preferred? Let's take a guess. You shouldn't be surprised on the basis of what I mentioned before. They prefer the one, they worked harder in the system in which they received a high salary, but they had reductions from that if they didn't produce at the level of production up here. They worked harder to avoid losses than they worked to achieve gains. How you frame a topic matters a great deal. And this is one of the most famous examples of framing. The final thing I'm going to mention is, and it begins on slide 19 and concludes on slides 20 and 21. I'm going to leave you to read those at your leisure. But it comes from a marvelous article by a lawyer economist at the University of Pennsylvania, Tess Wilkinson Ryan. I'm sorry, she's not an economist, she's a psychologist and a lawyer. And she did some experiments to try to talk about how we present choices to people can affect how they behave. I won't talk about the example given here. I'll leave you to read that later. Instead, let me point out what this experiment is about. Liquidated damages or stipulated damages are a doctrine in contract law that says this: as part of the contract, we, the contracting parties, are going to write down how much we have to pay the other person in the event that we breach the contract. That is, the parties themselves, as part of the contract, stipulate to the damages that each one of them will have to pay the other. Those are called liquidated damages or stipulated damages. And Tess Wilkinson Ryan did an experiment in which she tried to see if including a liquidated damages clause caused people to think differently about the choice between performance of a contractual promise and breach of that contractual promise. And here's what she found. She found that simply including a liquidated damages clause caused people to think about breach versus performance in the way that economists wish that people did think about breach versus performance. The old way about thinking about breach versus performance is the act of performing a contractual promise is a moral question. If you make a promise, you should comply with that promise. But economists and Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, for at least 100 years, economists have been saying, no, 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 that's not the way to think about performance or breach. Breaching or performing a contract is an economic decision. You should breach the contract if it's cheaper to breach the contract and compensate the other party than it is to perform the contract. You should perform the contract if the benefits exceed the costs of performing the contract. That is, if it's more expensive to breach than it is to perform, perform. If it's more expensive to perform than it is to breach, breach. What Telse Wilkinson Ryan found was that people think about breach of contract like that, the way we want them to, we economists want them to think about the choice between breach and performance if we include a liquidated damages clause. Whenever I taught this to a group of judges or lawyers or law students, they'd always say, this is the most practical thing you've taught all semester. And I said to them, yes, but I agreed with them. This is extraordinarily practical because it's a good guidance to how to draft a contract. If you want to draft a contract that people are going to think carefully about breach versus performance and think about breach versus performance in the way an economist wish they thought, include a liquidated damages clause. That's a very simple conclusion to a very simple problem. And it uses the tools of behavioral economics. Okay, I did not talk about empirical law and economics. I did not talk about legal institutions, which I said I would. I'm sorry, I've just run out of time. Hitesh, did you get the the cartoon that I sent to you this morning? I sent it very late. If you didn't, I can share it from my computer. But it's the last thing I want to put up before I answer any questions. Here it is. I always concluded my classes with this wonderful cartoon. It's how to acquire wisdom. And there are 6 easy steps. First, be alive. That'll help. Second, make mistakes. You're going to make mistakes. That's part of being alive. 3, learn from your mistakes. 4, repeat steps 1 through 3 until wisdom is acquired. But that's not the end of it. Number 5, realize that the wisdom you acquired in step 4 was not really wisdom at all. This realization brings new wisdom. And that leads you to step number 6. Repeat steps 1 through 5 for the rest of your life. I think that in a very concise way, this is the best advice anybody can give to anybody else. Live your life, make mistakes, learn from your mistakes, acquire wisdom, and then start all over again and learn more wisdom. Okay, thanks, Hitesh, for that. Now I'm going to see if there are questions in the chat. There's only one question here that I see. Isn't a jury trial, in a way, follows system 1, or alternatively, the defense lawyer represents or manipulates that way? That's a really good question. And I didn't say this, but I should have. I think you're right that without the guidance of a judge about what evidence is allowable, why it's allowable, what evidence cannot be introduced, I think that juries will use system 1 to decide whether the defendant is guilty or innocent. They may look at this person when they first come into the courtroom and decide on the basis of what they see, how that person is behaving, that the person's guilty or innocent. And we don't want them to do that. We make them sit through the presentation of evidence and the evidence that's presented and how it's presented is governed, we hope, by a judge who is aware of the maybe doesn't know the difference between system 1 and system 2, but they're following the rules of criminal procedure in deciding what the jury can be told and what it can't be told. And if some evidence is introduced that's manipulative, they can declare a mistrial and start again. It's a really good question. And one of the things that I think is worth mentioning is that behavioral economics presents a lot of examples of how lawyers who represent clients in court or before a regulatory agency or in a public setting, how they might take advantage of the attention and other flaws in human decision making that we've seen to make the best case for their client. There is manipulation obviously going on all the time. And the manipulation that is used to get people to think in a particular way is particularly noteworthy. One last comment I want to make about this. There's a doctrine in contract law called unconscionability. Unconscionability arises when one of the two parties to a contract has taken advantage of the other party. That's a manipulation, a private manipulation. And to my knowledge, nobody has ever written an article from the basis of behavioral law and economics about how contract terms should be viewed as unconscionable because they manipulate the thought processes of somebody else. The example in the article by Hossein and List about how the employer structured the compensation contract is a close example. The employer was manipulating the employees to work harder by the manner in which he presented the compensation system. It's a good question whether that's okay or not. Okay, here's another question. Would it be right to say that any economic theory is only as good as the assumptions it's based on, since people's behavior cannot be predicted with precision? Sure, I agree with that entirely. And that's one of the reasons I have been so deeply taken by reading the psychological literature that shows the imperfections in our thinking. I have questioned a lot of what we're doing in rational choice theory because of the literature I've read. My hope, by the way, the last clause here, since people's behavior cannot be predicted with precision, I think one of the great things that behavioral law and economics has done is make the behavior of people more predictable. I don't think rational choice theory predicts what people are going to do very well. But I think that behavioral law and behavioral economics or cognitive and social psychology predicts how people are going to behave pretty well. And I made this point early in the slideshow, and I hope you'll go back to it and look at it. When we're making laws, we ought to realize we're dealing with imperfectly rational people. Yes, they will be deterred by the sanctions that we impose if they commit a crime, and the crime is detected and they're caught and they're convicted. But we have to take account of the fact that the criminals are going to be over optimistic about their ability to get away with what they're doing. And we ought to find some way to lower their expectations so that they're making a realistic estimate of getting away with the crime, not an over optimistic one, because that'll lead to too many crimes. And in tort law, it may lead to too many accidents. We don't need to take this safety measure in our production because people aren't going to sue us. I don't want people making decisions like that. I want them to make accurate decisions rather than ones that are flawed because they're imperfectly rational. Okay, Hitesh, you had your hand up.
So I think Tejaswini has already asked the same, but what I was I was trying to make a point. The behavioral economic is based on experiment, and experiments are done on specific settings.
Good.
So where geography, culture, social norms, and I think the sample size is not significantly, it's limited. I'm not talking about vaccine, because in vaccine you have done significantly, but whatever the research are being done in the academic world, not in science, but in academic world, even in psychology and law and real economics, they are particular to particular place. So when even prospect theory or whatever the theory we have discussed, I feel that maybe what the Tejaswini was trying to say, that it's very hard that instance may occur even in your country, but variability will be there. That's what I just want to say, sir.
It's a great question, and it's a question that's very frequently asked and should be asked. And that is, are you biasing your results by the circumstances and the groups that you're doing your experiments on? The vast number of these experiments are done on students in universities. Students don't have to be paid very much. In fact, most of the time they'll engage in these experiments if you give them a candy bar or a Coca-Cola. So it's cheap to do the experiments on students. If we did those same experiments on people in the real world, would we get the same results? If we did those experiments on people who were over the age of 60, just to pick a number, would the results be the same? Those are all fair questions. And they're part of the chicken example that I ended the lecture with. We may have made mistakes in doing our experiments, and the solution is to do more experiments. That's one of the things, if I had had a chance to talk about the experimental law in economics, one of the things you learn from doing empirical work is there's almost never an end to doing experimental work, because people will say to you things that are perfectly reasonable, like, would you get the same result if you did this experiment at a retirement home? It's a fair question. And the answer is, I don't know, but the action should be, I'll do that. I'll try it. I'll get a student to go out and do it as part of their doctoral dissertation. This is one of the aspects of the acquisition of information that I think is so important for all of us to realize. This is a group effort. Sure, individuals like Isaac Newton make incredible contributions, but there are very few Isaac Newtons in the world. And I think if all of us can work together and learn from one another and do this collectively and collaboratively and cumulatively over time, we're gonna get better answers. So your question is exactly right, Hitesh. And I think the solution is to do more work to see the extent to which some of these behavioral, these thinking imperfections, these imperfections that we have in thinking about the world and taking our perceptions and thinking about them, whether we can learn more. When I first learned about this literature, that was the very first question I asked the psychologists. Can you draw inferences from what you've done with college students to what people out in the real world do? And they said, of course, they're the same people. And to your question about whether people in India and China and Zimbabwe and Germany are the same or different, that's a fair question too. And I think economists have been much better about recognizing that there may be differences in how people make decisions in different countries because there are different cultures and different experiences. Economists have been very good about that. Lawyers, I'm sorry to say this, lawyers have been horrible about acquiring information through experiments and careful empirical studies. When I first joined the faculty of the law school, I heard from them all the time that we base our outcomes on evidence. Evidence, evidence, evidence. It's very important. And when you ask them a question about how many contracts were written in Champaign County, where we live? How many contracts were written in Champaign County last year? And how many of them were successfully completed? They don't have any idea. But I think that's interesting information. I'd like to know the answer to that. So there's a lot of work to be done. And I would love to enlist more and more and more and more lawyers to work with economists and psychologists who have some expertise in doing empirical work to answer a lot of these questions about the law that we don't have answers to. You obviously pushed a button, Hitesh, and you pushed my button and I just started talking. I couldn't stop. I'm sorry. Renita.
Professor, on the aspects that you discussed so brilliantly on behavioral economics, like status quo, confirmation bias, and all of that. I was just thinking, is it possible that interventions like artificial intelligence, robotics would kind of,
Yeah.
have a really interesting to see what impact it has. But I mean, will it at a point of time really become very, I don't know, will it at a point of time become very
I think that's a brilliant question. Absolutely brilliant. I have for many years been thinking about writing a short article called The Upside of Robots. It's an unusual title, but any of us who've lived in the real world, who've tried to manage groups of people or try to understand why people make the mistakes they make, recognizes that maybe there's no hope for human beings to make the right decisions. And the right thing to do is give all of this to robots, that is to artificial intelligence, and ask them to make the decisions. We're going through, I'll give you an example. We're going through a very messy case at the law school of a professor who misbehaved with regard to the women law students. He did things that nobody should do. If our and we're how can we get rid of him? I mean, he's got tenure and he's had some distinguished scholarship. I said to the dean once, I said, if all of your professors were robots equipped with artificial intelligence, so that we had an artificial robot teaching contract law and one teaching property law and so on and so forth, you wouldn't have these problems because we could program the robots not to do very stupid things. And he said, I know, but then you'd have a robot dean, and he would have to manage the robot faculty, and how would that work? I think it'd probably work out pretty well. But I think you're right, Renita. And it's a fascinating point that arguably the more decisions we turn over to artificial intelligence, the greater the benefits to all of us. As I've mentioned, the number of automobile accidents that are going to occur when we have artificial intelligence driving automobiles and buses and trucks is going to be reduced significantly. And I strongly suspect that decisions about investments in many countries, including the United States, are being made by artificial intelligence programs already. I don't think there are a lot of individual human decisions being made about what stocks and bonds to buy and when to sell them and when to buy other ones. I think a lot of that is being driven by artificial intelligence. And there may come a day, probably not a happy day, but there may come a day when the artificial intelligence instruments have decided they have no further use for us. And I don't know what will happen to the human race. I'll tell you one last thought about this, and then you want to have a follow-up question. One of the things I've sort of learned as I've got older in life is to appreciate the quirkiness of human beings. Yes, they make mistakes, but in many cases they're charming and they don't threaten anybody. And they're part of our personalities. And it's joyful to get to know people despite their mistakes and flaws. Anyway, I'm sorry to go on. You have another question, Ranita, ma'am.
Again, sir, I mean, it can just go on and on, but the counter to this is, according to the economists that you are, in a cost-benefit analysis, how does it work out? To embrace the imperfections of human beings or to move towards this?
Yeah.
you
Good
know?
question. Write an article on it, Renita, and I would love to see it. I think that'd be a great article. And I don't know, I'm sorry to say, I think in many cases that an artificial intelligence in making sentencing decisions for criminal cases, in awarding damages in private litigation, I think the day is here. I'll tell you this, in fact, several years ago, our law review always asks the faculty for ideas about doing what's called a symposium issue. You have the same thing. We invite people to come or to write articles on a particular topic, and you can usually get the best people in the world to participate. I suggested several years ago that we do a symposium on artificial intelligence in the law. I think it's a great topic for symposium. Our law reviews in the United States are edited by students. And darn it, they're so young, they didn't think that artificial intelligence was in the law was an interesting topic. So they did not choose that. I have another question here. Can I see what this says? From a social justice perspective, the efficiency of artificial intelligence would depend on who gets to design the technology and implement it. Else the same mistakes and inequality would continue, as research suggests that algorithm can be biasable. Absolutely correct. It's not a solution to all of our problems, because as the questioner suggests, when you write the algorithms, you reproduce some of the same biases of racism and sexism and ageism that the people who wrote the software have. My hope is that we can design algorithms that are not racist, that are not sexist, and that are not ageist. But it's a great question, and we need to be well aware of this. That if I were designing my symposium on artificial intelligence and the law, that's exactly a question that I would ask a thoughtful person to write an article on. It's a great question.